Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue reading The African Personality in America and African Centered Framework by Kobe Cambone. We're on chapter 3, page 44, The Nature of the African Personality.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, Realm in the Bush. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for being here. Chapter 3 starts with a quote by Marcus Garvey. He said, "We have gradually won our way back into the confidence of the God of Africa, and he or she shall speak with the voice of thunder that shall shake the pillars of a corrupt and unjust world, and once more restore Ethiopia to her ancient glory." The nature of the African personality. Some fundamental criteria for a functionally relevant model of the African personality. In developing this model or theory of the African personality, several fundamental areas of experience guided, or at least definitely influenced, my approach. These were: A, my belief that the fundamental spiritual reality of African people throughout the world, based on my study of African history and culture. B, my recognition through study and observation of the historical and contemporary reality of European domination of African people throughout the world. C, my assuming a rigorous observational posture in relation to my own life experiences as an African person and the general experiences of African people, becoming a student of African and European behavior long before I began the formal study of psychology. And D, my fundamental respect for African life and its cultural integrity and sovereignty. Based on these considerations, I have sought to construct a model of the African personality which fits appropriately within the overall context of theory and research in African or Afrocentric psychology. Since the beginning of this endeavor, it has and was and continues to be my view that Afrocentric psychological theory must meet certain critical requirements and expectations that are relevant to both the historical and contemporary African biopsychical, biopsychical and socio-political condition. I was able to identify at least six fundamental criteria or requirements, and they are as follows. The first fundamental requirement for a truly relevant model of African personality is that the model must be Afrocentric ideologically and philosophically. That is, the model, its definitions and key constructs, etc., must be firmly and affirmatively grounded in the historical cultural reality and condition of African people. It must utilize the reality of the African worldview and the need for African self determination as its primary frame of reference. The second requirement is that the model must include a biogenetic influence or determinant in the African personality formula in order to realistically represent a truly racial cultural personality theory. I believe, of course, that the biogenetic basis must constitute its foundation. The model must be able to account for obvious differences in behaviors and functioning and overall condition of biophysical and biopsychological distinctions that characterize Africans and Europeans wherever they are dispersed throughout the world. The model must be as unambiguous about this biopsychological parameters as it purports to be about its psychological parameters, rather than the more typical ambiguous presentation of this issue. Hence, African personality must have biogenetic integrity so that it does not permit the obscurity of inappropriate applications to non-African populations and groups, as can often be the case when only psychological parameters are used in these kinds of approaches. 3, a functionally relevant model must explain the basic African nature of the African psyche apart from European cultural oppression and assimilation effects on the African personality. And it must draw a clear distinction between the dynamics of normal and abnormal functioning in the African personality system. In other words, the model must address the critical indigenous conditions of African people and cultures, which defines the nature of normal psychological functioning and behavior, independent and outside of cultural influences, such that aberrations can be clearly distinguished. In short, the model should identify the critical African ingredient, core, and essence, which defines the uniqueness of the African personality as it is articulated by African cultural reality and the nature of any aberrations that may possibly occur in relation to it. The fourth basic requirement is that the model must explain how European cultural oppression or white supremacy domination has affected African personality functioning. That is, it should explain what have been the specific psychological effects of European cultural oppression and domination and how these effects have occurred. In other words, the nature of the processes involved. The fifth requirement is that the model must explain or at least suggest how to maintain order or normal functioning in African personality and how to restore order where disorder occurs. Thus, the model must not only define the normal condition of the African personality, but it also must define how to nurture and reinforce the condition of normalcy, as well as how to correct disorder in the African personality system. The sixth and final requirement for a truly functionally relevant model of African personality is that it should have explicit liberation implications or consequences for the African mind. In other words, the social political realities of the African world today, where the African mind has been incarcerated by European worldviews, dictate that a meaningful model of African personality must provide us with the necessary psychocultural references, reference, reference to allow us to break the shackles of our unnatural mental bondage and thrust us toward our full development, affirmation, self determination as African people, as an African world nation. Now, naturally, the model, which addresses requirements numbers 1 through 5, should automatically fulfill the sixth and final requirement. These, then, are the 6 criteria or expectations that have guided the development of the present model. It is therefore my belief, of course, that the model of African American personality advanced in this book makes a serious attempt to respond to these fundamental requirements for functional relevancy. We will now turn our attention to a full consideration of the actual model itself. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. This African-centered model proposes that the African personality comprises a complex and dynamic biophysical system which generates several African cultural specific psychological and behavioral traits. The foundation or fundamental organizing principle of the African Black personality is called the African self-extension orientation. It comprises the basic energy source inherent in the system. African self-orientation, extension orientation, and African personality. The African self-extension orientation has several basic characteristics. First, it is an innate, biogenetically determined, immutable, unconscious, and deeply rooted psychical energy or dispositional energy potential that exists in all people of substantive African descent. This condition will be clarified later. It is substantially and operationally defined by the concept of spirituality. Spirituality represents a dynamic synthesizing energy that propels the self to extend and merge into the totality of communal phenomenal experience, transcending time and space, and with the ability to achieve cosmic synthesis. It is optimal in its optimal state. Operationally, then, the process of spirituality involves, in part, the urge for mergence into the totality of communal phenomenal experience and ultimately toward cosmos unity. Thus, spirituality is the key ingredient of the ASEO, which defines the African psychological process as a dynamic, physical, metaphysical unity extending from the person to the cosmic levels of communal phenomenal experience and expression. So we are one with the universe. The African self, it must be remembered from the most ancient conception, comprises a communal, ancestral, and cosmic self at its deepest level of being. Thus, at the core of the African self-extension orientation, or the ASEO, we find a cumulative pool of African ancestral knowledge, will, and intent that is locked away as deeply as in a deeply rooted psychical, spiritual storehouse or vault, awaiting the great liberating keys. In other words, the proper nurturing of the melanin dominant system, returning to the practice of ancestral communion rituals, fulfillment stages, or rites of self transformation required to unlock and rediscover the deepest well of our ancient wisdom and our spiritual pathways to African cosmic unity and perfectibility. The ASEO is thus the deeply rooted, unconscious spiritual process through which each new generation of Africans continually move towards their essence, the completion of the circle of cosmic unity. African cosmic consciousness. The ASEO then represents the spirituality disposition and potential that is genetically transmitted in African people and can be inferred in all of the basic behaviors and psychological functioning characteristics of the African race. Greetings, Brother Bakari. Thanks for tuning in. Ancient African foundations of the ASEO. The nature and meaning of the ASEO construct has its roots in the ancient principles and practices of African culture, particularly in the Nile Valley. It was always the case in African thought that the essence of all things is spirit or soul, and that all of life, everything, was governed by the principles of Ma'at. Thus, the African cultural deep structural concepts of spirituality and soul and Ma'at are intricately interwoven into the ASEO construct. As Akbar has observed, this kind of deeply rooted self-extension consciousness is of a much greater depth than the brain consciousness which most people have reference to when they think of extended self-consciousness. For the ancient Africans, it meant spirit or soul. There were 7 dimensions or divisions of the psychical system or soul as it was conceptualized in Kemetic culture. They have been identified as the following: the Ka, the Ba, the Kaba, the Aku, the Se, the Ptah, and the Atum. They were viewed as constituting the natural form of the human psyche and human physical transformation toward cosmic wholeness or perfectibility in the African sense. The Ka, or principal body, was the first division of the soul. It was the formal structure of the psychic nature which gives substance and returns it to its essential being or essence of spirit through disintegration. Some observers advance the view that there are several dimensions or transformations of the Ka as it journeys through the life cycle. In this view, the Ka reaches its ultimate expression as the divine Ka, the embodiment or sum of the 7 dimensions of the soul. The Ba, or breath, was the second division, representing the transmission of the breath of life. This breath dimension of the soul represents the first breath from the Creator to the ancestors and from them to their descendants. It is therefore transmitted from generation to generation of African people. It is the invisible source of all visible functions. The Kaaba is the third division or dimension of the soul, and it means to veil or to cover. It represents a luminous, intangible covering of the Ba and produces emotion and motion. It is responsible for sustaining sensory perception, color, blood circulation, delusions, and some bodily ailments like diseases. The fourth division of the soul, the Aku, is the seat of intelligence and mental perception. It is characterized by attributes like judgment, analysis, and mental reflection, all of which can be trained and disciplined to be dedicated to serve higher expressions of being. The Seb, or fifth dimension of the ancestral soul, or psyche, which manifests itself during adolescence, represents the self germinating or self creative power of the soul. In other words, the power to generate one's own kind. The sixth division, or the Ptah, represents the first intellectual father, the union of mind and brain, or the achieving of mental maturity, intellectual governance of conduct was then attainable. Atum, the seventh and final division of the soul or psychical system, represents the division or eternal soul. It represents the complete or fully creative soul in perpetual continuation. The ASEO is therefore the embodiment of the ancient African principle of Ma'at and the dimensionalized and transformation of the soul. The cardinal principle of Ma'at serves as the synthesizing ontological force in this process of the transformation of the soul spirit into cosmic consciousness or African perfectibility. Where overt expressions of ASCO are concerned, some of the unconscious manifestations of our ancestral deep well memory can be derived from analysis of African symbolic behavior and spontaneous expressions, among others. In particular, some of the cultural rituals and practices of diasporan Africans can be explained in terms of the ASEO. So these things are part of your ancestral memory, and you're acting out something that they acted out in prior generations. In her brilliant analysis of the African spiritual retentions throughout the North and South American regions, Marimba Ani identifies the African spiritual systems of Vodun in Haiti, Candomblé in Baja, Brazil, and Obia in parts of the Caribbean. She also identifies many other traditions of Yoruba, Yu, and Fawn rites, rituals, and cultural celebrations, as well as the ritual drama in the hush harbors, night sings, and ring shouts utilized by the enslaved Africans throughout the Maafa. Most of these African traditions have been confused by their descendants to this day, over 300 years later. Thus, these songs, music, dance, rituals, and other cultural practices among diasporan African groups all represent the vital dynamic forces of the African ancestral deep well memory of the ASEO, expressing itself across generations after generation of the African personality. So the things that we do and did in church growing up and the things we were taught to do were not really supposed to be representative of the things that white people thought they represented. It used to be codified language. The ASEO thus is rhythm, and rhythm is balance and harmony. Rhythm is synthesis, order, where all elements or aspects, in other words, all interrelationships, fit perfectly together in a dynamic whole. It enables spirit to synthesize energy to return to a balanced, harmonious state, in other words, equilibrium. In my initial statements of the nature of the ASEO, I was intentionally open and flexible in this area. The main consideration was to convey the idea that the ASEO extends back to the Septepi, the very first occasion in ancient Kemetic cosmology, and the occult accumulation of African experience into the presence. It is therefore the spiritual core, the consummate sense of we-ness, cosmic or ultimate collective consciousness. Hence, the ASEO has no I-ness dimension, only deeper and deeper levels of we-ness through the ultimate dimension of cosmic oneness. It is the psychical vessel of the true black hole. At the deep level of we-ness, then, is cosmic wholeness, as Nobles refers to nothingness, pure spirit. This is why a second primary component of the African personality is necessary in order to give form and direction toward African self-determination and affirmation in the political ideological sense. He used a lot of words to talk about the fact that we are one with each other and we had coded messages in our religious practices. African self-consciousness and African personality. The second major psychological component of the African personality structure represents the conscious core system called the African self-consciousness. African self-consciousness derives from the African self-expression orientation and operates synonymous to it under normal natural operations and conditions. The ASC, or African self-consciousness, functions as the at the conscious level organizing principles of the African personality. That is to say, it is the conscious embodiment and operationalization of the ASEO. In this regard, it represents the conscious level African survival thrust in African people. Like its host, the ASEO, ASC is relational, collective, and communal self-consciousness. Because the ASC is a conscious level process, however, it is subject to social environmental forces and influences. Thus, unlike the ASEO, ASC is partly a genetically determined disposition and partly an environmentally determined disposition, because consciousness evolves in part through experience. Also, as is the case with ASEO, in its essence, ASC constitutes a dynamic, synthesizing, spiritual, physically transcending energy when functioning optimally enables the self to merge into the totality of conscious communal phenomenal experiences. African self-consciousness represents the developmental transformation of the ASEO through the individual African life cycle. ASC exists at various levels because of this transformational process, however, expanding the transforming to higher and higher levels of expression. Higher levels of ASC development permit greater and greater conscious access to the infinite repository of our ancient African knowledge and wisdom. Recall that at the deepest level of ASEO is cosmic wholeness or pure spirit, the nothingness. That is why ASC is necessary to give form and directed thrust to the ASEO toward Afrocentric self-determination and self-affirmation. Thus, ASC follows a developmental pattern due to its partial dependence on environmental determinism or experiential development. When this core conscious system of the African personality is nurtured developmental as well as situationally through the indigenous personal and institutional support systems, it achieves vigorous and full expression in terms of a congruent pattern of basic Afrocentric traits, such as beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, which affirm African life and the authenticity of its African cultural heritage. Hence, in a psychosocial sense, the African survival thrust inherent in ASC represents the affirmation and self-determination of African life. Chief among critical indices of African self-consciousness are such attitudes and behaviors as the following: awareness of one's African identity, a collective consciousness and African cultural heritage, and sees value in the pursuit of knowledge of self. A recognition of African survival and positive development as one's number one priority. Respect for and active perpetuation of things African, African life, and African cultural institutions. And lastly, maintaining a standard of conduct and resolute and uncompromising resistance to all things anti-African. Deviations from this pattern of normal functioning in the African self-consciousness core of the African personality are explained in terms of variations in the personal and institutional support systems characterizing the developmental and experiential life spaces of the individual. Hence, variability in actual manifestations of this basic African personality disposition is explained in terms of experiential variability among individual Africans. So your experiences can impact how much of this African self-consciousness you have. It is dependent upon the extent to which early socialization experiences and/or significant institutional, systemic processes and support systems actively nurture and reinforce your African self-consciousness. In a homogeneous pro-African racial culture developmental context, a strengthened reinforcing effort would expect to characterize ASC development. This positive outcome is due to the fact that the early socialization experiences and institution systemic supports have a greater probability of being Afrocentric in nature. On the other hand, in a more heterogeneous or anti-African racial cultural developmental context, either physically or psychosocially, the conscious operation and manifestation of this natural African disposition is likely to be weakened and distorted by such potentially mitigating sociocultural circumstances. Analogous to this process would be the experience of removing a plant from its natural habitat or nurturing environment and finding that it does not develop to its full potential. If it develops at all, and may even manifest distortions from its natural expressions, such as dwarfism, odd coloring, and premature breakage of foliage, stem splitting, etc. So when they take you out of your African-centered environment that is pro-African, you become distorted, you become small, you augment and change yourself to fit into this European-centered or European-centered worldview that has been thrust upon you because you're in a world of white domination. A variety of psychologically distorting, indoctrinating circumstances of an institutional systemic nature can also interact with, and in some cases can override, ambiguous individual personal socialization conditions. An example of this type of circumstance would occur in a multiracial, multicultural society where most of the basic institutional systemic processes outside of the family, and in many cases, penetrating the family boundaries, are determined and controlled by European American worldview. Thus, both individual differences and collective behavior among Africans, as well as African mental health, particularly in the so-called American hemisphere, and the African diaspora can be explained from this framework. Chapter 5 will provide a fuller treatment of the developmental issues related to ASC. Suffice it to say here that while no threshold level of ASC is to be postulated as the critical level, ASC is presumed to occur in varying degrees, influenced by many possible experiential environmental factors that may be peculiar to each individual. Thus, weak, moderate, and strong ASC are probably more functionally descriptive as categories or levels of ASC in this regard. On the other hand, a critical difference threshold no doubt does exist between, for example, a weak ASC condition and the condition of an alien self-consciousness, probably depending on a variety of related conditions. Such issues as these, as well as others generated by the model, will be clarified through extensive research in this area of focus. The second component of African personality, ASC, clearly has some political implications for African functioning, although this is not the primary reason for its existence. The ASC, or African self-consciousness purpose for existence, is to drive and guide the functional adaptiveness of the African personality system within the boundaries of its cultural sovereignty and integrity. So it's to develop you within your own African-centered world. It fortifies the African personality system by giving it awareness, intentionality, efficaciousness, as it fulfills the African survival thrust. In effect, it gives the system the ability to fulfill its inherent African survival thrust. ASC thus defines, reflects, and facilitates the conscious level African survival thrust in normal and healthy African people. It represents the natural, conscious, collective survival thrust of the African psyche, including, most importantly, conscious, purposive, African-centered psychological functioning and behavior. In defining the conscious nature and direction of the African survival thrust, ASC functionally gives conscious meaning and purpose to the operation of the innate and unconscious. The intricate relationship between the ASEO and the ASC is depicted in this chart I'm about to describe. As can be seen in this chart, the ASEO and ASC operate harmoniously, in fact, in unity, or as an undifferentiated force within the African personality system, thereby reinforcing the African survival thrust in African people when they're functioning correctly. This condition consists of the basic ethos of oneness and harmony with nature, communal phenomenology, African-centered knowledge of self and a sense of group determination, commitment, obligations, destiny, and survival. In other words, as was stated earlier, ASC represents the conscious level expression and manifestation of the deep-seated and unconscious ASEO. Thus, to speak of ASC under normal natural conditions is to speak of ASEO. One dimension is encompassed by the other. To repeat, the all-pervasive ASEO is the foundation of ASC, and they exist as a unified, undifferentiated process, merely having unconscious and consciousness dimensions. So your African self-consciousness, which is your basic conscious structure, nature and environment determined, along with your African self-extension orientation, which is your basic unconscious structure, which is innate and epigenetically determined, feed into your basic traits or your Africanisms, your conscious and unconscious manifestations, which then feed your African survival propensity, and they propel you to African survival because they nurture your African survival thrust. African self-consciousness is therefore key in the construct of the African personality system. As noted above, it directs as well as reflects the conscious level African survival thrust in African people's normal, healthy psychological functioning and behavior. While the African personality can indeed be validated in the real world, experiences and practices of African people, ASC is also that aspect of the African personality system which has good heuristic value in the sense of being accessible to more direct empirical assessment. Therefore, ASC can be assessed through more or less direct, systematic, empirical examination. Hence, research on African self-consciousness and the predictions generated from this construct has provided for an empirical analysis of African personality and mental health in North America. A more detailed treatment of this 12 to 13-year research program will be presented in Chapter 6, where he'll also be talking about cultural misorientation. Melanin, the biogenetic basis and infrastructure of African personality. As noted earlier, African personality in terms of ASEO constitutes a biogenetically based psychological phenomenon. Its primary genetic component is the melanin molecule, a molecule of complex chemical structure and its related structures. Melanin is a dark-colored, most often black, highly complex molecule which characterizes African people when it occurs in heavy concentration. It is, according to this model, one of the vital keys to understanding the biogenetic infrastructure of African personality. It is very interesting to note that although a great deal of knowledge about melanin has been generated in the so-called medical sciences, particularly over the past 3 centuries, there are reports that the U.S. National Health Institute of Health has cataloged over 300,000 articles on melanin. Very little in the way of public discussion and presentation of this knowledge. In other words, extensive textbook coverage has occurred. So it's another way that they're studying us without studying us. Only in recent times have a few attempts by African scientists been made at organizing and synthesizing such knowledge taken place. Nevertheless, it is clear that even though our African ancestors of the Nile Valley civilization possessed great knowledge about melanin, much of that knowledge has been lost through Eurasian military and cultural plundering and destruction of African institutions of knowledge in their 2 to 3,000 year encroachment, which has actually been relentless warfare against African civilizations. Thus, while our knowledge and understanding in this vital area is very much incomplete as a result of our Eurocentric miseducation and the European colonization of knowledge about melanin, we have begun again to achieve some level of comprehension about this highly complex biochemical substance or molecule. In the technical sense, Carol Barnes, an African chemist, defines melanin as follows: a heterogeneous or different subunits, polycyclic, many circles or rings, polymer of high molecular weight, many chain links, containing several types of important bond linkages: saturated carbon, unsaturated carbon-carbon, carbon nitrogen, peroxides, ether, quinine, organic, organelle, non-metallic, etc., and are generally brown to black in color. Different chemical subunits, bonds, and functional groups arranged in a specific order give melanin its unique chemical and physical properties. Melanin is a molecule, a complex chemical structure which is from brown to black in color. It is black to allow its chemical structure to absorb, retain, store, and regenerate energy, light, and sound. Once it contacts the molecule, it stores energy in the form of light and sound and is capable of charging itself and generating its own energy fields for a variety of communication and metabolic functions, among other things. The melanin molecule is manufactured throughout the body in cells called melanocytes. Within melanocytes are small black organelles, energy bodies called melanosomes, which actually produce the melanin substance by converting small chemical units into melanin. In Africans, which are the melanin dominant group, the melanocyte cells are black in color because they are virtually saturated with melanosomes, along with other smaller chemical units from which melanin is converted are melatonin, tyrosine, serotonin, and others such as dopamines, norepinephrines, and epinephrines or adrenaline, as well as other chemicals such as purine. There's a variety of chemicals listed. These smaller chemical units either polymerize, which is form a chain, or in some cases copolymerize into melanin molecules. Thus, melanin can be produced from a variety of chemical substances and also has the special capacity of reproducing itself when other substances from which it can be derived are insufficient for its production. Melanin is also believed to be produced in other cells such as leukocytes or white blood cells and mast cells. Melanin is located throughout the body in some very important areas, namely the brain and spinal cord, or the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and the endocrine system. It is also in the bloodstream and therefore in the heart and arteries, the liver, muscles, the skin, sense organs, and the gastrointestinal tract, and the sex organs. It is most important to recognize that melanin dominant groups, such as Africans, melanin exists in high concentrations in these areas. It is an extremely stable chemical resisting most experimental Analysis. Melanin can bind and release most unknown elements, sometimes functioning as an energy conductor and sometimes as an energy insulator. It can convert light energy into sound energy and back into light energy again. It can produce or neutralize free radicals called radical radiation, and it can undergo many chemical reactions at once, which probably influence smooth rhythmic movement. Its superconduction capacity allows it to conduct electricity without offering any resistance to the flow of electricity, as previously indicated. Melanin functions throughout the nervous system of the body, in organ functions such as the brain and spinal cord, as well as throughout the processes of neurotransmission, sensory perception, muscular reaction, body metabolism, and reaction to disease, illness, and injury. In melanin dominant individuals, there have been identified at least 12 major sites of melanin or melanin centers in the brain alone. Among these are the substantia nigra, the midbrain reticular fomentation, and ventral tegmental area, the pontine reticular formation, the locus coeruleus, and the glial cells. We should also recall that both sorantin and melatonin, two of the important substances from which melanin is synthesized, or the neuromelanin, are hormones secreted by the pineal gland, located in the very center of the brain. The activity of the pineal gland responds to the circadian 24-hour cycles, in other words, light and day, dark and night cycles, whereby the secretion of melatonin into the bloodstream increases during the nighttime period and decreases during the daytime period. The Afrocentric sciences, it is believed that during the daylight periods of the cycle, the melanin system concentrates on absorbing and collecting and processing and storing light energy in its electrochemical substance, while it concentrates on regenerating and distributing these substances during the night or darkness phase or your sleep rest cycle. Nevertheless, the system also can and does perform both of these functions irrespective of time of day relative to other internal, external events and conditions. Hence, melatonin or melanin is light sensitive and is influenced by the circadian rhythms that sets the body's biological clock. Clearly then, where the brain and nervous system are concerned, heavy concentrations of melatonin and serotonin in terms of their derivative melanin and their many complex electrochemical aspects generated by this special molecular structure, when highly concentrated, have a multitude of biological and psychological functions in the melanin dominant individual. So he was on that melanin and melatonin as medicine, and we make our own medicine and can heal ourselves type stuff. Thus, the primary influences of melanin in the neuropsychological psychical system defines much of the uniqueness of the African personality, melanin dominance recessive Africans, as distinct from other racial cultural groups. In short, melanin operates as a super energy absorber, processor, storer, conductor, generator. Where race and its melanic biogenetic infrastructure is concerned, the conditions of melanin dominance and melanin dominance recessiveness produces coloration of the skin from a light or golden brown to black, depending on its degree of concentration. It is believed that melanin concentration also influences the occurrence of some other phenotypic traits, characteristics, as well as a number of important genotypic characteristics that will be discussed later. Demelanization or albinism is a recessive biogenetic condition where melanin recessive relative to melanin dominance, wherein the influence of melanin is minor. Melanin dominance, on the other hand, means that the influence of melanin is dominant throughout the cellular system of the body. African people are melanin dominant, and Europeans, Caucasians, and whites are melanin recessive, according to Dr. Francis Welsing back in 1970, as are others who have argued that since the majority of the peoples and races of the world are black, brown, and so-called red races, manifest the ability to produce relative melanized states to some degrees higher melanin concentration in contrast to albinism and demelanization, then clearly melanization or melanin dominance represents the normal biogenetic state of affairs among human beings. Thus, a number of African scholars in this area take the position that melanin dominance represents the natural biochemical capacity for optimal human functioning, a state best epitomized by the people of African origin. Greetings, Sister Raw. How are you tonight? Thank you so much for tuning in. We only have a few more pages to go, guys. This chapter was heavy with a lot of the science. Melanin dominance and the African self-extension orientation. This model of the African personality proposes that melanin dominance constitutes a primary aspect of the biogenetic basis of the African personality system, where the relationship between melanin dominance and the core of African personality, ASEO, is concerned. This model proposes that melanin dominance comprises one of the essential biogenetic components or determinants. The basic position here is that the biogenetic condition of melanin dominance defines to a large extent the condition of Africanity. So the more melanin you have, the more African you are. The highly concentrated melanomes in the melanin dominance condition probably contain and generate the ASEO psychogenetic material, which germinates the African personality potential. Well, we know that's not true. There is much evidence which supports this perspective that melanin dominance defines the basic biogenetic foundation of African personality. This evidence suggests, for example, that melanin dominance refines the central nervous system and in so doing produces a highly sensitized metasensory perception, arousal, excitation, and a reflective regenerating cyclical network involving the functioning of the pineal gland, the cerebellum, the red nucleus, the reticular formation, and the right and left hemispheric higher order processes of cognitive coordination. As noted earlier, melanin is a primary component of the complex hormones adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and is thus involved in rapid neurotransmission and the operation of the autonomic nervous system activities of rapid arousal, emotional responsivity. In this same vein, African scientists have argued that there is evidence of a relationship between melanin dominance and such psychological traits as so-called higher order intelligence, consciousness, and what we call the superconsciousness or psychic ability. Given the wealth of evidence that melanin dominance influences sensory perception, rapid nutrial transmission, and muscle skeletal activity, and so-called higher order cognitive emotional functioning, and given the nature of the ASEO core component, of African personality, in other words, spirituality, that has been presented here, the position of this model that melanin dominance comprises the biogenetic basis of the African personality is quite tenable and compelling one. Even much of the oft-times obscurely presented data pertaining to melanin dominance and behavior, when reinterpreted with Afrocentric cultural framework, clearly supports this view. Consequently, given the propositions of this model of African personality and what is believed to constitute the relationship between cognitive emotional experience as well as sensory motor reactivity in general and the central and autonomic nervous systems, there is little question that further and more rigorous examination of these relationships will add significantly to the analysis and fuller understanding of the African personality. Suffice it to say that at this point, that is, that this model views melanin dominance as essential to the functioning attributed to the ASEO and therefore produces a distinct and unique pattern of response to the worldview in African people relative to non-Africans. Melanin dominance in African spirituality. Notwithstanding the importance of melanin as essential biogenetic infrastructure in the African personality, the ASEO, it is of added importance to note that melanin dominance is also present in the external environment in such locations as the soil, plants and vegetation, creeks and streams, lakes, rivers, and seawaters, and in animals. It is believed that melanin dominance regulates all signals from the external environment of the cells into the cell's inner structure where information is processed and a response or action is delivered back to the external environment. Under melanin dominance conditions, melanin granules or particles are also believed to have mind states within them such that each one operates as a central computer, analyzing, processing, and initiating bodily reactions even without reporting to the brain. As an energy absorbing, processing, storing, and generating system, it has been proposed that melanin dominance probably operates from the innermost depths of the cell, the micro African self, to the outermost cosmic reaches or limits of the universe, the macrocosmic African self. Because energy, light, sound, rhythmic sounds, magnetism, etc., is everywhere. Energy is omnipresent, invisible, active motion, and rhythm. It is always connecting the interconnecting, which is the process through which it becomes visible by taking on form. Thus, energy, the substance of melanin dominance, is always striving for unity, wholeness, the overcoming or penetration of boundaries, seeking oneness or harmony with the universe. Hence, all of the energy that has ever been and ever will be is accessible to the melanin dominance condition, it is argued. Melanin dominance thus obtains energy freely, directly from the environment as well as from within itself through regeneration. Melanin dominance, according to this viewpoint, opens up all energy channels or frequencies and constantly accesses them. Psychic energy, extrasensory, or meta energy processing capacity is central to basic melanin dominance activity. It would appear, therefore, that melanin dominance can cause or permit altered states of consciousness, such as those experienced in African rituals, ritual drama, and in spiritual ceremonies of various types practiced by Africans around the world. In a sense, this process represents a basic aspect of what is meant by spirituality among African people in the technical sense, oneness with the universe, nature, and the Creator. African theorists have thus postulated that the complex array and synthesis of melanin dominance functions within the African personality operationally defines to a large extent the spirituality process. The basic African personality traits can be discussed in chapter 4, such as expressiveness, improvisation, flair, social affiliation, propensity, religiosity, etc., are all expressions of the cardinal process of African spirituality. Melanin dominance and African personality in perspective. The reader should recall the earlier discussion in chapter 2 and in this chapter about the nature of the African personality, where heredity versus environment determinants and African biogenetic melanin dominance are concerned. In that discussion, I noted that Black equals African psychology makes the assumption that in persons with mixed racial ancestry, being an offspring of both an African and non-African person, Africanity dominates the personality system, psychological functioning, and behavior of such individuals if, and only if, its biogenetic presence is minimally evident in their biophysiological characteristics. So if they look like it. This idea or intra-African racial identification practice, of course, is neither novel nor negative. It merely articulates the basic practice of the African community in intragroup, intraracial relations. In other words, people of partial mixed African ancestry who do not look like a pure form of their non-African ancestry are generally regarded as Black equals African by the great majority of the African communities dispersed around the planet. This position, then, does not argue necessarily for a direct relationship between the degree of one's African phenotypical traits or the physical surface observable characteristics and the degree or strength of one's African personality manifestations or potentiality, or one's psychogenotype in this sense. It merely proposes that those racially mixed Africans, melanin dominance recessive individuals, who do not phenotypically approximate a pure type or passable form of their non-African ancestry, should possess African personality. In other words, melanin dominance potential and are therefore capable of the same melanin dominant psychological functioning and behavior as other African people. As the analysis generated by this model of African personality will argue, all melanin dominant individuals ultimately require melanin dominant or affirmative Afrocentric support systems for optimal individual collective expression. The main idea being advanced here is that even though our knowledge is clearly incomplete at this stage of the rediscovery process, a model of this type must address the widespread prevalence of racial amalgamation miscegenation in the diasporan as well as continental African populations. So he was worried that these multiracial people that have been created through various reasons, sometimes no fault of your own, have to be addressed because he said, I repeat, a model of this type must address the widespread prevalence of racial amalgamation or miscegenation in diasporan as well as continental Africans. And they were writing in the 70s when they wrote that. Thus, we must be open to the possibility that there may be some variations among Africans in more than epidermal level melanin concentration that may have psychological implications. Certainly, given our current understandings of melanin, it may be reasonable to conjecture that some relationship or variance may exist between the degree of melanin concentration among Africans and African personality expression, although not necessarily in potential according to the theory. That is to say that melanin dominance and melanin dominance recessiveness, so Black people and their mixed brethren and sister, resulting from mixed racial ancestry, may affect African personality expressions in different ways, particularly where recessiveness heavily influences the latter case, limiting either optimal expressions or some special attributes of African personality expression. Whatever the case may be, it must be acknowledged, again, that no substantive conclusions can be drawn at this point about the nature and biophysical meaning of some seemingly apparent intra-race variations in melanin dominance recessivity. They appropriately must await future Afrocentric scientific exploration and study in this vital area of African-centered self-discovery and redefinition. Meanwhile, I want African readers to rest assured that I am not in any way suggesting that intellectual absurdity of developing measurement instruments to assess degrees of Africanity. Thank goodness. Nor am I suggesting that any other method of definition assessment should be undertaken or come to occupy our energies as meaningful and defensible scholarly scientific pursuits, either ideologically, politically, or philosophically. What this model is suggesting, however, is that since melanin dominance was indeed the natural and original African biophysical condition, as the original human form was defined by the Creator, which our ancestors referred to as the perfect human form, then a primary goal in our return to African world order must be a biogenetic biophysical return to the optimal African biogenetic perfect Blackness, melanin dominance form. So go back into your Blackness. This goal can be pursued through the progressive, longitudinal, or generational maintenance or practice of rigid racial inbreeding. In other words, maintaining African racial hegemony by whatever means necessary. This biogenetic return to melanin dominance optimization, therefore, should represent the primary overriding biogenetic goal of all future generations of Africans on the planet as we seek to reestablish an African world order. This issue is far too critical to the ultimate survival of the African world to be approached outside of the framework of the long-range goal of reestablishing African world order for African people. Thus, as we continue to examine and discover more and more knowledge about melanin and its essential role in African psychological functioning and behavior, we will become better able to define and promote optimal African personality functioning. The lack of more definitive synthesis of the available knowledge will soon become a thing of the past as more and more Afrocentric scientists with broad-based multidisciplinary expertise who are dedicated to African world order become involved in this effort, as I feel certain that they will. At the present time, there are a number of viable and highly plausible hypotheses to direct our research efforts in seeking to better understand and articulate the biophysical nature and parameters of African personality. For now, we in African psychology are certain that the effects of melanin dominance and its attendant processes on African biophysical functioning are the most substantial and pervasive. Conclusion. The all-pervasive ASEO and ASC can thus be plausibly inferred in practically every major dimension of African peoples' psychological functioning and behaviors. As I have noted elsewhere, the operation of this process can be inferred in the highly abstract nature and conceptual depth of African peoples' basic beliefs and attitudes, the rhythmic nature of African speech patterns, and the abstract and fluid conceptual elasticity of meaning in African language, content, and speech. African people's distinct interpersonal style, including extended kinship system, call and response, and fundamental social orientedness, the multidimensional and polyexpressive nature of African perceptual acuity, and the fluid and rhythmic nature of African people's motoric response and physical expressiveness, among many others. All of these features of African functioning and behavior are believed to reflect the direct tendency towards self-extension into the totality of phenomenal experience. In other words, the ASEO. Pierre Ernie has observed in relation to this issue that the African cosmos is like a spider web. Its least element cannot be touched without making the whole vibrate. Sister Ra, I have to check. Let me double check. I believe I did, but I don't know if I was able to respond because my phone shut down. So let me check to make sure. Everything is connected, interdependent. Everything cooperates to make up unity. Drawing upon Ernie's analysis, the nature and operation of the ASEO and ASC may be similarly viewed. That is, the spiderweb analogy is appropriate for illustrating the complexity and intricate interrelatedness of the basic traits of African personality, which will be discussed in detail in the next chapter, and the underlying core processes of the ASEO and ASC. The intricate interconnections of a spider web represents the all-pervasiveness of the ASEO and ASC in the African personality. Each spindle in the web extends from the core or center to the outermost regions, forming intricate interconnections as they extend outwardly, spiraling in every conceivable direction. Such then is the basic nature and operation of the ASCO and ASC in the basic traits of African personality. Every dimension of African psychological existence, in other words, thoughts, feelings, and actions, thus flows into the other and to the limits of the phenomenal experience, forming one rhythmic unity as defined by the core. This process has even been referred to as the rhythm of Black personality by Akbar in 1975. Recognizing the centrality of the ASCO and ASC in definition and defining the dynamic operation of African psychological functioning and behavior is absolutely essential to understanding the African personality as an Afrocentric process. In summary, then, this model proposes ASEO and ASC as the basic, core, fundamental organizing principle in the unique biophysical nature of the African personality. Virtually every basic feature of the African people's unique, distinct lifestyle can be argued to flow through these internal and external cores of African personality and can only be meaningfully understood in this particular framework. This principle holds irrespective of where African people might be located in the world or the particular point in time in which they are observed. He said a lot, but what he was talking about melanin being supreme and dominant, and he spent quite a bit of time in that. He sat in that for a while, which I don't necessarily agree with, because as Oni has said in the past, we don't have necessarily genetic superiority. We have genetic equity because we have generations of people that were Black 2 or 3 generations ago, and because of sexual selection, they have now turned into white people. And while it's possible for them to push out a brown baby every now and again, it's unlikely that they will push out a brown baby every now and again. He did say something good about being at the point where you have to make a deliberate decision to breed back into Black. You have to make a deliberate decision to mate with a Black person. You have to it has to be intentional if you want Black power, and at all costs, whether it's arranged marriages or you are making love matches with Black people, you have to help bring about an African world order. Sister Raw asked me a question, and yes, I did receive my gift. Thank you and the elders for that. I appreciate you so much. I value you. There is another book that I really want to read, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to read part of it tomorrow. I don't usually go live multiple days in the week, but it's a book called Unburdened by Conscience. And it is a retelling of history. It is sitting with the pain of what we experienced throughout chattel slavery from the perspective of an African American. And it is going to be good. So instead of waiting until next week, I'm going to continue Kobe Cambone next week, but there's going to be a playlist called Sitting with the Pain, Remembering the Pain, that we're going to read this book, Unburdened by Conscience, because I think it's an important book for us to read. I think there are some things we have forgotten. I think that there are some things we're not necessarily teaching our children. And we're sitting here going around talking about our hair's on fire, and this man is doing all this stuff, and he keeps doing different stuff each and every day. And we're forgetting the fact that, these people have these people have a history. They have a long history of doing these things to us, and we need to remember that pain. We need to remember what it is, and then we also need to remember protest, politics, pockets. Protest, politics, pockets. We need to hit their pockets So we need to direct our dollars to Black equals African businesses. We need to protest. Well, protesting does not mean going getting in somebody's face each and every day. Protesting is going to talk one-on-one to your local congressman and flooding their office with calls, emails, and messages. Okay. And politics, that we do politics. We write policies. We write up what we want. We have our own version of a Project 2025. We write up, okay, just look at the framework that they did, and then start your own narrative, or get with a group of friends, or reach out to me. But we cannot sit here and just say that our hair is on fire without remembering the pain that these people have put us through. And we cannot sit here and just say that we are going to just let this happen and we're trusting that someone else is going to fix it. It's up to us to fix it. Oh, Sister Ross said, we love you much and your reading helps everyone out here. The story is very important. The story is very important. I'm so glad that we learn for ourselves, that we take the time to learn for ourselves, and that there's so much knowledge and information that we take for granted. So this week, our interim book is going to be Unburdened by Conscience. And I'm going to read that for a few days. It should be a quick read, but it's a really good book. And with your help and support, I was able to buy that book because it was $50. So I appreciate each and every one of you for being here. I appreciate the Black Business Network. I appreciate Realm in the Bush Forecast, Sister Ra, and the elders that listen with her. I value all of the gifts and the support that you show me. Thank you so much for spending your Monday afternoons with me. And like I said, I just need 2 hours tomorrow and 2 hours for the next couple of days, starting at 7 o'clock, so that we can get through this other book, because this other book I think is more interesting. It's not as academic, but we need to know these things that Kobe Cambone was talking about, because with this internal and external worlds, with this environment versus nature versus nurture conversation that he's having about the African identity, we need to understand that more, and we need to get to the point where we are creating these environments that are healthy for our children. We need to create spaces that are safe for our children so that they can thrive, because like he said, a plant will wither when you uproot it from its natural environment. A plant will wither when you uproot it from its natural environment. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening tonight. I value you, and I want you to remember,
every single thing that touches your life, whether it is religious, social, or political, must be an instrument of your liberation, or you must throw it into the ash can of history.
Now, I'll be back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. We're going to read Unburdened by Conscience by Anthony W. Neal. He talks about the American slave system in a world where he probably thought we were reaching for a post-racial reality, because he was publishing during the Obama administration. He was writing during the Obama administration. So he probably thought that we were ready to face our dark past, which we are not. All right. I thank each and every one of you for being here, and I will see you tomorrow, guys. Peace.